Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending today's webinar. Um, Today, we're here to talk about our webinar, More Than CMMC, Intro to Compliance and Cybersecurity. My name is Larita Ba, and I will be moderating today's webinar. I'm joined today by Bill Wooten, the Chief Revenue Officer here at C3 Integrated Solutions. Hey, Bill. As well as Scott Whitehouse, who's our Security and Compliance Practice Lead. Hello, Scott. So, Bill and Scott worked closely with defense contractors to design, implement, and manage compliance-focused IT and cybersecurity solutions. So there's no one more qualified to talk about compliance and cybersecurity as it relates to the DIV. Today, we're going to be talking about the complex web of compliance and cybersecurity requirements that defense contractors have to navigate. Bill and Scott are going to break down how different types of data trigger different requirements, and we're even going to give you some insight into what to expect next as we discuss upcoming changes to the NIST 800-171 standard. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to Bill because he's much more interesting to listen to than I. Bill?
Thanks, Larita. I doubt that, but we'll do our best here. So we've got a fairly full agenda today. We recognize that for a lot of folks out there that, we start hearing these terms, CUI and NIST and CMMC and DFARs, and they start to overlap. Sometimes they start to blur a little bit. And we thought it'd be great to take a few minutes today, use that as a topic to kind of start to walk through what all of these topics mean. This is intended to be kind of a little bit of a basic level conversation. We could take probably any one of these major bullets here and easily do an hour-plus long webinar. We've done that in some cases with all of these. But we're going to start out talking a little bit about what is controlled unclassified information. Then we're going to talk about the roadmap and the methodologies of protecting it using NIST 800-171. And that'll follow by the enforcement mechanisms to kind of encourage folks to go ahead and use NIST and protect CUI itself. A couple more requirements, things like export controls we'll cover on the back end of it. And then we'll just spend a minute or two talking a little bit about us at C3 Integrated Solutions. Scott and I are going to trade off back and forth in topics, hopefully to kind of shake things up a little bit, to keep everyone interested. Where possible, we're going to try to have a little fun with this as well. We realize it's compliance and not exactly the most interesting topic, so we'll do our best as we get going through with all of this. So I want to start things off with a poll question. Just kind of level set everyone in the audience. Looks like we got a great crowd today. So first poll question is, the threat to national security through the loss of sensitive information is A, a significant danger to our warfighting capability, B, important but really not worth all the fuss, and C, not that big a deal at all.
Yeah, it looks like we've got some great consistency here. Either everybody thinks that somebody's watching or we've got great consensus among the audience. 100% are looking at significant danger to our warfighting capability.
Fantastic. Awesome. Well, it's good. It's good. It's always important to kind of level set the crowd in the beginning of an event, in that, we all recognize that this is a serious issue. And kind of wanted to start off with, I'm actually almost a little bit embarrassed to show this slide as part of the presentation, but there's a reason for it. And if you look really closely on the bottom end, this slide was from 2016. And this is as far back as we've been talking about the various reasons and the challenges around protecting sensitive information. This was inspired by, borrowed from a DoD deck, and it's important to continually remember that there's an impact for us not protecting sensitive information. The talking point on this has always been, it took us 30 years to build the F-35, took the Chinese 5 to build their version of it. There's a reason for that. Their R&D team was really based in the US, and by them being able to take information, and it really is, at the end of the day, the reason why we are all here. And when we talk about protecting government data, this is another kind of a little bit of a classic slide, but it was really helpful to kind of set the tone for what we're looking to talk about. We break things into thirds. We look at this bottom third of data that is owned by the Department of Defense and in a Department of Defense information system. Obviously, it's not part of the scope and what we are talking about today. But in the top 2/3, when you look at the right side of it, this is information that sits on a government, on a private industry system, but is operated on behalf of the DoD. Think about maybe a web application that is the DoD application, but it just happens to be housed in a government contractor's either data center or in their cloud version. Whole set of different requirements for those types of systems, and we'll touch on that briefly with 7010. But again, kind of not really where our focus is. Our focus is today on that left third, where we're talking about a contractor's internal system, and the security requirements are NIST 800-171, DFAR 7012, and it's to some extent FAR Clause 204-21 as well. We're generally talking about covered defense information, which includes CTI, controlled unclassified information, and federal contract information as well. So when we talk about CUI, controlled unclassified information, this is a standard that is managed by the National Archives. And the whole idea behind this is it standardizes the way the executive branch handles unclassified information. And effectively, the easy way of thinking about it is it's data that is not classified data, but really should not be in the public domain. And if you go to the NARA site, the links there, we will make the slides available after the event. There's really about 20 organizational groupings that fall into 124 individual categories that can be considered CUI. Some of the classic examples of this are things like controlled technical information, export control data, critical infrastructure information, legal, nuclear, PII information, proprietary business information, financial information can all be considered CUI data. Now, there are also two different types of CUI. There's CUI basic, which is essentially what falls under the rules of the National Archives. And then there's also a term called CUI specified that you'll see from time to time. What CUI specified is it's CUI data that has an additional requirement on top of it, some other additional law or regulation that adds additional incremental requirements on it. The example we usually focus on in these conversations are things that have, say, ITAR controls or naval nuclear propulsion data, where there's an additional requirement of not just everything we're going to talk about today, but data sovereignty, which we'll cover in the back end of the presentation as well. So, Scott, this is where I'll hand it off to you and talk a little bit about how we protect CUI with NIST 800-171.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. So when we think about CUI, the fact that it exists and our obligations to protect it are a bit known, right? If we have a contract that has DFAR 7012, then we know we've got an obligation to protect it. And the default standard for protecting it is using NIST 800-171, of which the current version is Rev 2. 171 is kind of the younger brother of 853, right? When we think about where this all starts, it starts with 853. And one of the things I hear a lot of people talk about is how hard and heavy it is to get through 171, right? 171's got 110 controls. It breaks down to 320 assessment objectives. 853, on the other hand, is this. Compared to 171, it's a big difference. I like to make that demonstration because while 171 isn't easy, right? There's a fair amount of work to do. It's important. NIST has done a good job of tailoring down to CUI what is required for our DIB contractors, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. And a lot of times, I almost feel thankful that we don't have to do 853 on a day-to-day basis to control and protect CUI. Next slide. For those that are the eager beavers, we may have heard about a new version of 171. This is Rev 3. This was released just a couple weeks ago and is currently in a draft form, meaning NIST has published it and said, hey, this is what we're thinking about for the next iteration of 800-171. For those playing along at home, remember, if you have DFAR 7012 in your contracts, this will be for you at some point in time. Right now, Rev 3 is in a draft format. It's open for comments. Comments are available through July 14th. I highly encourage download, read it, provide feedback to NIST. They use this and they do tailor The final version's based on public comment, so please take the time to read it. I'd love to say it's a fun read, but it's not. With 171 Rev 3, it's really a reflection of a 853 Rev 5 release, right? So 853 was updated to revision 5, and then NIST takes that and tailors it down to Rev 3 for 171. This becomes important to note because as we're thinking about, well, what does this control mean? We've got the big brother to look at, right? When we've got this to refer to, there's a lot more information there. There's more guidance. And what's really kind of neat is there is an assessment guide. So assessment guide is your cheat sheet. This is where you know what questions are going to be asked on a test. Now, there isn't an assessment Rev 3 today. There probably won't be one for quite a while. It's not anticipated that an assessment guide will come out until well after Rev 3 is finalized, and there isn't a definitive date for that as of today. So for right now, the guidance is continue to plan and prepare for Rev 2. Quite honestly, if you think you're going to have an assessment, go for Rev 2 and try to get it done sooner rather than later. Go for the version that's a known entity as opposed to trying to prep for the new exam that nobody's been through yet.
Yeah, and it's probably important to point out the obvious. Rev 3 is not easier than Rev 2. It's not like the test gets easier. It's not like the standard gets easier. It's always going to continue to get a little more challenging, a little more harder. They're always trying to keep pace with the threat that is out there and the requirements that are out there. So to that decision point, if you think waiting it around until still Rev 3 comes, that's just going to make your life as an organization seeking compliance a little bit harder on that end of it.
Yeah, NIST likes to, that's a good point, because NIST likes to do a little silly thing. They'll say, hey, look, it's still 110 controls. But what they don't say is they took X number of the old controls and just kind of made them sub-bullets to previous controls. And so the total number of controls remains the same, but your requirements and the things you have to do have actually expanded.
Yep. Right?
It's the devil in the details there. So absolutely, if you're looking for CMMC compliance, or if you have DFAR 7012 in your contracts, get rolling on Rev 2. You're going to have a easier time than you will with Rev 3.
Yeah, all relative, of course, but it's definitely the smart guidance to provide on that. So I'll get us over to our second question, which is what are the mechanisms to enforce protection of CUI? Is it CMMC? Is it DFAR 7012? Is it ITAR? Perhaps it's all of them. All right. Looks like we got a little bit of a mix here. About 75% of the audience is pointing out that all of the above are mechanisms to protect CUI. That is accurate. CMMC 7012 and ITAR are all components of it, and that'll kind of get us into the next section of talking about how we enforce those protections, or how the government enforces those mechanisms for protecting CUI. And this really does start with the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, better known as DFARs. And there's a couple of clauses that are relevant here. For those of you who don't understand DFARs, folks who do government contracting, they all agree with the Federal Acquisition Regulation. That's essentially the contractors signing when you sign with the government. The Defense Department has a supplement to that where they go and add some additional requirements above and beyond the FAR. Relative to CUI, there are really 4 clauses that are relevant and that pertain to CUI. There's 7012, 7019, 7020, and 7024. Now, when we look at these, 7012 gets all of the attention and all of the spotlight, and Scott even mentioned it a couple more times about, this is the one that kind of everyone pays attention to. 7012 has been around for over 5 years now, and it was really the first big attempt by the government to help encourage and force contractors to go ahead and protect CUI. It says the contractors shall provide adequate security on all covered information systems, which is essentially if you have a system that holds CUI, that's considered a covered information system. And when you take 7012 and you break it down, it really starts with a left or right turn. It goes back to that comment we made earlier of, is data or is CUI held on a system that is operated on behalf of the government? Again, using the example where maybe there's a government application that really in any practical sense, the government will be one operating it, but because of contractual reasons, it's housed or operated by a third party. That takes you up across that top bar there, and your controls really get deferred up to 7010 and NIST 853 that Scott was just talking about. If you're operating on behalf of the government, that system's treated like a government system, and that's the standard you need to measure to. However, if it's not operated on behalf of the government, and this generally applies to just about everything from an internal IT operations system, if you store, process, or transit CUI in the course of your business, then NIST 7012 applies to you. And there are really three major components of 7012. All systems must meet NIST 800-171. If you're using an external cloud provider, it must be the equivalent to FedRAMP Moderate. And then there's also clauses C through G. And really what C through G does is it takes, the typical NIST cybersecurity framework talks about protect, detect, respond, recover. This adds the next layer to it, which is really more forensics driven. It requires contractors to report incidents within 72 hours of discovery. It requires you to preserve information and do everything you can so that the government can come in and understand what was breached, what was used for that breach, and how much information did they get? Did they get access to one person or everyone, one file or all of your files? And that's the whole intent behind clauses C through G. There's a whole sidebar we could take with cloud providers where if they need to meet 7012, this is generally where most of them fall down. We won't go into that today, though. We will talk a little bit about the challenges with DFAR 7012, though. I said it's been around for 5 years now, and what it did is it sort of treated CUI as one size fits all. And the enforcement mechanism with 7012 was self-attestation, which meant that contractors could kind of just raise their hand and say, yep, pinky swear, I absolutely did everything I should be doing here. I'm compliant, I'm good to go. Let's move on and keep doing things. The reality was contractors weren't doing it. There was very, very low adoption from 7012. There's some studies that were done. I think Scott will talk about them in a couple minutes around the adoption rates for 7012. And as a result, we still had the security problem that we've always had, which is systems were left unprotected. And ironically enough, this also created a competitive imbalance. As a contractor, if you spend the money to invest in cybersecurity and do what's right to protect your systems, your embedded rates may wind up being a little higher than someone who's cutting corners and cheating the system, and now you are at a competitive disadvantage. So as we get into talking about CMMC, we'll talk about how CMMC is designed to address some of these challenges. It's also important for us to talk about a couple of other rules that are relevant with respect to CUI. The first one is 7019. 7019 was part of the interim rule that was rolled out back in November of 2020. And what it did is it established a couple of different things within the contractual process. It formally established that the DCMA audit program could be put into contracts. And this has a two-tiered system. There's a basic assessment, which is a self-assessment, and medium and high assessments, which are actually administered by DCMA. And as a result, all contractors must perform a basic assessment, which is essentially a self-assessment grading on 800-171, and you need to put the score, the results of that assessment, into the SBRs system. You can put you do not have to be 100%. Most folks aren't. In fact, if you are, they kind of look at that as a little skeptical. But you do need to put a score into SBRs to continue to receive awards from the DoD. It will also ask you to put a completion date if you have a plan of action and milestones relative to what are you going to do to get to that perfect score with NIST 800-171. Additionally, there is DFARS Clause 7020, which requires contractors to provide access to facilities, systems, and personnel in support of assessments. Sounds kind of silly, but they actually had to put it in writing that if the government wants to come in and do an assessment of your systems, it is in the contract now as a result of 7020. The other thing that was big that it established is it formally established that throughout the supply chain, a prime needs to have some level of validation of their subcontractor's cybersecurity posture. And that extends not only at the first layer, but every layer through the supply chain if that end provider or subcontractor is going to hold CUI data. Finally, I want to take a minute and talk a little bit about DFAR 7024. This is brand new. It came out kind of quietly and just went into effect a little bit over a month ago, actually a month and a day ago now. And what it does is it gives contracting officers the power to consider SBRs risk assessments when they're evaluating an offer. And that could be done based on item risk, price risk, or supplier risk, which is the one that we really kind of care about. And it essentially allows a contracting officer to take a look at two offers, and even though one might be a little bit cheaper, if they evaluate a different level of risk to it, they're not locked into necessarily going one direction or the other. This is especially important if your SBRS score is, say, -25 compared to someone who's a 95, and the contract specifically does have some very sensitive information. Now the contracting officers have a little more freedom to be able to make a little bit of a different decision than they would have been locked into before. So that's important. It's relevant. It's important when you're doing your SBR scores now to take a very serious look at, treat them seriously as something that could be used and evaluated. Scott, back to you. Let's talk a little bit about CMMC.
Yeah, the fun times, right? So CMMC, we're in our second iteration. It was released a couple years ago. DoD did a little bit of a pause and came out with version 2.0. See, with version 2.0, we have 3 levels. We have a level 1, which is considered foundational. This is 17 practices, and it's a self-attestation, right? That's the pinky swear that they're trying to get away from. The catch is this level 1 does not apply to those who store, process, and transmit CUI. It's really intended for those that have federal contract information, FCI, where the DoD kind of says, it's not all that important. Then we go into level 2. This is your CUI, right? I go back to DFAR 7012 because this is your easy ticket to know if you need to do this. If you have DFAR 7012, prep for CMMC level 2. Good thing is, in theory, we're doing this already, although, you know, most aren't, right? There was a study that DFAR released last fall where they showed that contractors who submitted an SBRS assessment said, hey, we've got an average score of a 56. When DFAR went through and performed an assessment on those same organizations against 171, their average score was a -56. There's a 100-point swing there. So this is why we've got CMMC, is somebody coming through saying, hey, we need to do an assessment. We want to verify through a third-party organization, a third-party assessor, that you're actually doing these things. That kicks in with level 2, right? Level 1, self-assessment, pinky swear, big thumbs up, yep, we're doing it. Level 2, now somebody's checking your work. The homework's being graded, right? This is 110 controls. It really is 800-171 Rev 2. We also have level 3. This is kind of the mystery box. It's been described as the 110 controls from 171 plus, and we don't really know what the plus is. So there's plenty that there's rumors and general thoughts that this is going to refer to 800-172, but nobody's really willing to put that in writing that is an authority source. You won't see that coming from the Cyber AV, haven't seen it come from the DoD. It's a general thought, we'll say. Next slide. So when we think about 7012 and DFARs and why CMMC is here, the general concept is that DFARs is CUI is a one-size-fits-all. So while it can cross multiple different agencies within the federal government, the big challenge is that it's a self-attestation, right? I talked about that 100-point swing that DFAR put out. That's huge, right? Those are organizations that said, yeah, we're doing this, and either didn't understand how to do it properly or maybe overstated how well they were doing it, but that culminated in a weak adoption, and then ultimately cyber vulnerabilities, hence the data theft that we see from our adversaries. In CMMC, we've got our 3 different levels. We have our C3PAO assessments, right? Coming in, grading our homework, and comes the forced adoption, right? No longer is mom and dad saying it's okay for us to just give them the thumbs up, we're doing it. Now they want proof, right? And when you think about this, right now, CMMC has options through the Joint Surveillance Program to get certified today. This is under the Rev 2 guidelines, CMMC 2.0. Bill mentioned about the ability to do a supplier risk score as part of your contract award. Those organizations going through that early adoption program have that piece of paper and say, hey, I'm actually doing CMMC. I'm a lower risk than the other guy because I have my piece of paper. I've been graded. So just a kind of thought, if you want to get ahead of the line and be able to apply on contracts with your piece of paper and your thumbs up, there's an avenue to do so.
Sounds great.
Next slide.
Scott, go a hair off script. You want to talk a little bit about Cyber AB and how they fit in the role with the assessment part?
Yeah, so Cyber AB is the governing agency over CMMC, right? They're the ones that technically own it. They work in partnership with the DoD, but they are a separate entity, right? They are not owned by the DoD. They are a separate organization altogether. Their job is to maintain the standard. So they put together the marketplace, the training curriculum, they certify all the assessors, and when you go through an actual assessment, they're the ones that issue your accreditation. So when you sit through that process, an assessor comes in, or assessment team most likely, they'll review all 110 controls. They will go through all that. They'll gather documentation and evidence of satisfactory completion, hopefully. And then they submit a recommendation to the Cyber AB. Cyber AB reviews what the third-party assessment organization has put together and then issues the certification. So that's a big shift, right? Your third-party assessor is not the one that actually gives you your certification. That is actually coming from the Cyber AB.
Yeah, I think it's important also to note that, technically we're waiting for the final rule with CMMC. The Joint Surveillance Assessment Program is a program where the DFCAC is essentially deputized companies that they have authorized as a certified third-party authorized auditing or assessing organization. They're out there doing these joint surveillance assessments today, kind of giving folks that early adopter state of approval from a CMMC standpoint. And there's kind of a wink, nod, and an expectation that if you've gone through this program, you've gotten past that assessment, you will get grandfathered into CMMC. And this is a way of kind of priming the pump and getting folks authorized while we are also waiting for CMMC to become a final rule in contracts themselves. All right, let's move on to the next one. One more set of requirements to talk about a little bit here. We'll talk about data sovereignty. Scott, you want to run with us?
Sure, sounds like fun. So data sovereignty becomes a subset of most folks, right? We have CMMC, we have CUI. Not all CUI is ITAR, not all CUI has a data sovereignty or an export control, but some does. And so when we think about export controls, the conversations usually lump in CMMC. We hear FedRAMP, especially when it comes to cloud service providers. DFARs doesn't necessarily tell you whether or not. Hopefully you have a good contracting officer that tells you whether or not you're going to have certain types of CUI, but sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. But the big key is that with export controls, it's restricting data access to US persons. And so this is both in viewing and physically possessing the data. So when we think about export controls from a CUI perspective, we're really looking at something that's tagged as no foreign. That's a very specific tab. We see CUI / no foreign. This is a export control document. We obviously have our friendly ITAR controls that we know about, right? Those two have a data sovereignty requirement on it, meaning that we are strictly adhering to where the document can live, as well as who can access the document. Next slide, please. When we think about that, we have data residency, right? It's got to sit inside the US. This becomes really important if it's stored in the cloud. It's really easy to say, hey, my data center sits in the US, but we got to look a little layer below that. Where are the backups going? Where are the replication centers for that data? If we know that the data center is replicating outside the US, maybe it's sitting in the UK, maybe it's sitting somewhere in Europe or other locations, right? Anything that has a data sovereignty requirement cannot be in that data center. It has to remain inside the United States, including replication locations. That's key. We also have to worry about things like data spillage. Now, typically when we think about spillage, we're thinking of the bad actor and they're sitting there in their hoodie at night in their basement trying to access your data. But while that's a risk, we also need to think about the incidental ones, the ones that might be a blind spot for us. Things like support, right? Especially if we're coming in with a cloud service provider. Are they going to bring in a support element that might not be a US person? These are questions you need to ask and verify through your cloud service providers and make sure that you're on the right platform. With data sovereignty, all persons who have access to the data, whether it's just your company, your support providers, your cloud service providers, they all need to be US persons. The data must remain within the United States. And those are big keys because there are penalties associated with the spillage outside the US.
Yeah, and great example on this is we're very much a Microsoft shop, and when you look at versions of Microsoft 365, the reason that Microsoft went out and built a specific data enclave, a completely separate version of Microsoft 365 called GCC High and Azure Government, was specifically of this requirement. If you're in a commercial version or even the GCC versions of Microsoft 365, it has that follow the sun support model. There is a good chance if someone's working on your environment, it's actually going to be someone that is not a US person. And in order to accommodate that, they built an entirely separate version of the solution just to meet that requirement. And we've seen that with other providers. Folks like CrowdStrike has a federal cloud now. Salesforce has a federal cloud now. Folks that have taken working with the div seriously, this is something that they can answer pretty readily. And you can always tell when folks don't necessarily have a great answer to it, whether they've taken this requirement seriously or not. So moving along, we're going to take another shot on a poll question as we've kind of gone through this. Try to get an understanding of where people are with CMMC, taking a look at, where is your timeline to be compliant with CMMC? Is it something that you've been working on and you've pretty much been there, done that? Hoping to get it done this year, maybe it's on the roadmap for next year, or perhaps you've got a little bit of a longer window and you're planning to just leave that as a burden to your team. Scott, while we're waiting, I'll remind everyone of the story. We were talking to a SOC provider, a managed security service provider one time who assured us that their data was in the US, that the people were in the US, it was all operational in the US. We started peeling back the onion and we started talking about it, and they finally admitted that their dev group happened to be in India. But it's fine. It was all separated. It's not part of the production environment. We don't touch the production environment. And then we asked them, well, how do you do testing on the systems? And they said, well, we copy our production environment and we hand it over to them, and that's what they do their testing and their data on. So they were, we didn't use them as a provider as we move forward. But just a great example of how hard it is sometimes to go through and talk to vendors and really understand whether or not they're going to meet that data sovereignty requirement.
Yeah, I think one of my favorites personally was a gentleman who was I believe he was out of South Africa, and he says, well, we don't really adhere to it, but I promise not to look.
Yeah.
I love that. I can just imagine writing in my system security plan, while they have foreign nationals accessing our sovereign data, they promise not to look.
They've actually pinky sweared. We've got pictures of it. It's fine. So
yeah.
It's an important notice. It is an important piece of data sovereignty to talk about, though, is that it's not so much about whether or not a non-US person has access to data, just the simple fact that they have the ability to becomes an unintended spillage. So you don't necessarily have to have someone poking around and opening files. Just the fact that they have logical access to it maybe an admin password. Even if they never execute on it, it's still considered unintended spillage. So it's an important thing to talk to. All right, awesome. Looking at the results of our final poll here, looks like we've got about 13% or so that are ahead of the curve. They've been there, they've done that, and overwhelming percentage, 61%, have it on their mind this year, on their roadmap. They're working. Looks like you're actively working on it. If it's a goal to be compliant this year, that's awesome. It's great to see people doing it. About 20% or so are have it on the roadmap for next year, and hopefully those are budgeting and planning limitations and not just kind of waiting around for the final rule to come out. And there's about 5% of you where your kids are going to have that burden and feel sorry for them. So, all right, we'll kind of start wrapping things up a little bit. We want to take a little moment, just kind of tell you about who we are, C3 Integrated Solutions. You probably have heard about us before if you're on this webinar, but just kind of reintroduce ourselves. We've been a partner with Microsoft for well over 10 years now, celebrating 11. Next month will be 12 years with them. Over 6 years now working in the GCC high environment. And what that means is we've been working with clients to support 171, 7012, ITAR requirements for that long. It's a core component of our business. We've got well over 200 clients in GCC high right now that we have some level of management and administration with. Big news for us last year is we merged with an organization by the name of SteelRoot, truly a leader in doing some very innovative things in the way that managing clients and helping them to meet CMMC requirements. We're super excited with that, and we're now at a point where our solutions have started to come together and we're offering a unified solution into the market. We've got, of course, all the good stamps along the way there, being part of the Cyber AB, CRN MSP 500, and Inc. 5000 as part of who we are as an organization. When we talk to our clients now, generally our conversation centers around what we call the SteelRoot Compliance Program. And the idea behind this is to be able to, went one too far, let's go there, to kind of, there's 3 pillars into what we offer with this solution. And we're starting with the SteelRoot reference architecture, which is a defined use case, a defined set of system boundaries that we can deploy our CMMC-based design using a FedRAMP approved technology stack, which really sets everyone off in the right direction, really solid foundation, using that vetted baseline consideration and the implementation for our clients. That sets us up to be able to manage our service, manage those environments with our CMMC focused managed services, where you get things you typically expect from an MSP, system administration, support desk, security monitoring, all that kind of standard stuff. What makes this different, though, is those standardized procedures and processes that have been written from basically from the ground up to meet the requirements around CMMC and to be able to hold muster in an assessment. It includes managed configuration updates to ensure that we're not, you've got the latest version of what you should have from a configuration baseline, but also make sure that we're managing compliance drift by constantly making sure we're resetting the environment in a way that makes sense. And then finally, in our compliance advisory services, that offers a managed compliance program that's going to provide things like assessment ready documentation and assessment prep and assistance. This allows us as an organization to take responsibility for 80% of the tasks related to compliance and support your team through the other 20%. Now, no one's going to get you to 100%. You are always going to have to do background checks and physical security, and there's a whole bunch of things that are non-technical controls, but we'll work through there. We'll coach you through some of that. We'll help you out with some of those pieces there that you're still going to own yourself. Now, we also have a lot of clients where they will come to us and say, I plan to do the compliance part myself, or maybe my environment has some additional systems that are outside of scope, or perhaps even a third party that they are working with today. And our answer to that is the SteelRoot technology platform. And the idea behind this is we can still deploy the SteelRoot reference architecture, we can still deliver CMMC managed services, but we're going to allow that compliance service component to be partner driven or third party driven, in some cases even internally driven. That takes our part of the shared responsibility model from 80-20 down to about 50-50, because the majority of those things are compliance related pieces there. we're still going to take ownership of these level 2 technical assessment objectives, but in the big picture and the overall requirements of the 320 assessment objectives, it's going to wind up being closer to 50-50 on there. So with that, open it back up. We'll bring Larita back in, and we'll answer any questions that might be out there.
Great. Thanks so much, Bill. Thanks also to you, Scott. We do have a number of questions, and just a reminder for anybody that has a question but hasn't asked it yet, there is a questions box on the right side of your screen in the GoToWebinar control panel. The first question here is, you talked about the feedback session, feedback period for Rev 3 of 800-171. When do you expect that to go into effect?
So open comment is going on right now, ends July 10. After that period, NIST will take comments, review them. There is not a defined timeline for the final draft to be released, but we have roughly another 6.5 weeks until the open comment period ends.
Yeah, last week during CMMC Day, Victoria Piliteri, I hope I got that right, from NIST, one of the co-writers, spoke to it. She had talked about that period. There's public comment. They'll adjudicate that. They'll come out with a revised edition. There'll be another set of public comments. More than likely, it'll be sometime this time next year as a best guess, and that's very much a best guess on how long that process will take. And then there will be a whole set of other things to follow behind that around developing the 171A version, as well as how CMMC figures out a way to kind of integrate that as well.
Great, thanks. A little housekeeping thing. We've got a couple questions here with regard to whether or not they'll get copies of the slides or the recording. We will be sending the slides and the recording out to all attendees following this event. It'll probably be tomorrow rather than today. Couple of other questions here. Who determines what is CUI prime?
Not it.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a little bit of like, yes. So in theory, your contract should define what CUI is involved, and your contracting officer should be able to define what is and isn't CUI within the work you're delivering for the government. As a contractor, there are situations in which you may be the one creating that and have the obligation or right to tag it. There are also times where the government may be the entity that is determining what is CUI and will do so for you.
Yeah, there's a great webinar if you look into our site at c3isit.com that we did with Christina Reynolds over at BDO that covered well over an hour around what is CUI, when is it CUI, what should be CUI. It's a complex topic, and it's unfortunately not a clear-cut topic. And there's a lot of challenges in that space right now.
Great. Next question is actually specific to C3. Is C3 Solutions a government-approved certified CMMC assessor, specifically around level 2?
No, technically we are not. We are not on a track to be a C3 PAO or certified third-party assessment organization. We've made a decision. We're not going to go the assessor route. Our role in life is to be on the service provider side. We want to sit with our clients and literally sit alongside them as they go through the assessment process. So we're going to be on that side of the table. In fact, we are one of, well, there's only about 40 C3 PAOs out in the market right now. 2 of them are our clients, where we've literally sat down alongside them, went through the DFCAC assessment, and frankly answered about 2/3 of the questions from the assessors because of the role and the significant role that we play with their environment and how they're operating.
Thanks. Next question here is around data sovereignty. Are the requirements around data residency or data sovereignty specific to organizations that hold CUI?
It depends. So the data sovereignty is a subset of CUI. So we talked a little bit about CUI basic and CUI specified. So CUI Basic does not have a data sovereignty requirement. CUI Specified might, depending on what the specification is, and most commonly, not always, most commonly that specification is no foreign. So if you have documents that are tagged with no foreign, that does have a data sovereignty component. If your CUI is simply the CUI across the top, that does not have a data sovereignty requirement.
Yeah.
The next question's around CMMC and which levels. So this person asks, what actually determines whether or not we should be pursuing CMMC level 2 versus CMMC level 3?
Great question.
Yeah, so strictly speaking, if you hold a contract that contains CUI, whether you store, transit, or process it, you're going to need to follow the rules around CUI. DFAR 7012 already requires you to follow the rules around NIST 800-171, equivalent FedRAMP, cloud providers, as well as C through G. When we work with our clients and talk to them, we usually take a slightly more expanded scope around that to talk about not just the contracts you hold today, but what is the work you anticipate getting in the next 1 to 2 years? How do you envision your business progressing? Are there contracts out on the horizon that you would expect that may hold CUI, and that may also inform your investment decision? The other factor to look at is who are the partners you are working with. You know, very, very few people in this industry work by themselves. You're always a teaming partner, either as a prime or as a sub with a larger contract. If you are working with prime contractors who generally have a lot of CUI requirements, especially ITAR requirements, we're starting to see a lot more pressure from the primes to be able to invest and be ready to hold CUI, and it makes it easier for them to bring you into different agreements, different teaming agreements and contracts along the way. So the business decisions around there may be beyond what you hold today at this very moment.
Thanks, Bill. We've got another question here around data sovereignty, and I apologize to the person asking in case I reframed this badly, but they say, so what I hear you saying is that all data, including backup storage, must be stored in the US. Does that mean that they have to be stored in a federally approved location?
So there are requirements for the locations in which they're stored, yes. As far as like a specific, authorization from the government, not necessarily. And this is where it gets into some data may be classified above CUI, which is where the requirements will change. If we're just thinking CUI no foreign, then the requirement there is a FedRAMP moderate or greater environment, and then the sovereignty requirement, right? It's got to be sitting on US soil.
Yeah.
Thanks, Scott. Next question. Given the 7024 clause, if an OSC was generous in a prior self-assessment and submitted a high but not perfect SPRS score, does it raise any red flags to submit a significantly lower score this time, or possibly reframing to submit a new score until all refraining to submit a new score until all the gaps are filled? What's the best solution?
So it's kind of a static score in terms of you put your score in SBRS, it's there. You're not submitting a different score every time you put a bid in. It's you enter the score in SBRS. Contracting officer will go in and validate whatever that score is. You have the ability to change that score anytime you want. If it goes up, or if for some reason you realize maybe it should go down, you should probably aspire to be as accurate as possible with that score.
And one question is, how do we access the SPRS?
We can get that to you offline. There's a whole process to setting up your account and going through all of that. You will not be able to access it for anyone but yourself. It's one of the little kinks in the system there, quirks in the system is you can go and you can look at it. The government can go and check your score on it, but you can't necessarily go in SPRS and check, say, a subcontractor score. Great,
thanks so much, Bill. Next question is, do we offer a hosting solution for CUI to C3 specifically?
No, we do not. We use wherever possible, we use a FedRAMP approved technology stack that is kind of based. Our personal approach on this is basing our solution set off of the Microsoft platform, whether that be Microsoft 365, GCC, or more often than not GCC High. From a data center standpoint, we generally land with Azure Government as our go-to solution as a starting point. That enables us to be able to take advantage of all of Microsoft's hard work to be compliant, and then we can act as a provider to add value add across the top of that.
Fantastic. I think we've managed to get through all the questions. So Bill and Scott, thanks for running through the gauntlet here. We're glad that there were so many folks that were engaged in the conversation. If you didn't have a chance to answer a question and want to, you've got Bill and Scott's email addresses right on that screen there. As a reminder, we will be sending out the slides as well as the recording so that you can review the materials afterward. Bill and Scott, I want to thank you for a great presentation and for the Q&A session afterward. And to our audience, I want to thank you as well for attending the session. We hope you found it informative, useful, and enlightening. And if you need any support or have any additional questions, please reach out. This concludes today's webinar. We hope we'll see you on the next one.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.